In both Frostpunk 1 and 2, hunting is a major source of food. Not only do animals manage to survive the extreme cold, but they also appear to be thriving, as there are numerous, massive herds capable of feeding thousands of people after decades of frost. So that leads us to the question: is it possible for animals to survive in the Frostland without human support? And if so, how? Well, in classic fashion for this channel, it's a case of yes, but actually no. One of the best analogs we have for an ecosystem like Frostpunk's world would be Antarctica. It's a terrestrial ice sheet rather than ocean and islands like the North Pole, and because of that, its interior faces similar temperatures as those in Frostpunk, as the oceans tend to moderate temperatures. Landlocked regions like Siberia, Winterpeg, or Man It's Cold Out can face extremely cold winters, but also very hot summers because of this. We can also see the same thing in Greenland, as their cities are located on the warmer coastline, while the temperatures drop considerably inland. In addition, Antarctica is a completely isolated frozen ecosystem. Unlike the Arctic, where animals can migrate south and across the North Pole to completely different continents to find food. What we find in Antarctica is a general lack of biodiversity, particularly when we compare it to the Arctic. Natural plants barely exist, and the animal population primarily consists of migratory birds, penguins, and seals. The key trait of these animals being that they are coastal species, surviving off the ocean rather than the land. Seals don't so much endure the extreme cold, rather they avoid it by living in the water. Water, by virtue of being liquid water, is going to be much warmer than the frozen environment, and the floating ice insulates it from the weather. In our world, this marine ecosystem already thrives under the ice with minimal sunlight. But in Frostpunk, persistent cold would freeze the surface of the oceans, even if it were still liquid underneath. Wind, ocean currents, tides, thermal expansion, contraction, and even the seals themselves can work to break up the ice for them to cross through. But with the extreme cold in Frostpunk, it could also cause these holes to freeze over, and in turn, the seals would either drown or be cut off from the ocean to freeze in the wind or starve. If the ice could stay broken up and they had some hidden cavern to shelter their pups, then the seals would probably have the best chance of survival of any animal that we see in Frostpunk, as their ecosystem is the least affected by the frost. If we look back at one of my previous videos on some of the reasons for the generators being in the north actually making sense, was that the flora and fauna were already adapted to the cold weather, where almost all of their life would certainly die off due to the cold. Arctic natives like caribou, reindeer, muskoxen, and Arctic hares already endure cold of -40 to -50 before they even shiver. However, when the weather does get this cold, they survive by sheltering or grouping up and limiting their activity to avoid exposure and limit their energy burning. So they'd hardly be thriving and would eventually be forced to move in order to find food. To make them maybe a little bit more hardy in a lore-friendly way, we could say that they eat a bacterial or fungal symbiote, which helps to keep them warm, kind of like what we get with the Bohemians. And we do find that muskoxen are adapting to the cold by growing even thicker coats. But this still doesn't solve the most glaring problem: storms and starvation. And storms bring with them hurricane-force winds, which by itself would be dangerous. But not only that, the temperature plummets below -100 degrees Celsius, and we even see -150 degrees Celsius during the Great Storm. If we assume that part of the reported temperature is including wind chill, not just the air temperature, they still would face temperatures well outside the natural survivability of even Arctic wildlife. But I think there is a simple solution which would also work towards our next problem, and that would be migration, which caribou are actually quite famous for. Perhaps they recognize the signs of an incoming whiteout and just migrate away to safety. This is something that we see can happen with the random hazards in Frostpunk 1's Endless mode. Unfortunately, Frostpunk 2 wasn't quite as inspired, and hunting is simply a mineable deposit that can be turned on and off. And despite the game denouncing unsustainable hunting, it offers no option to actually do so. But I digress. Animals, and even human Frostlanders, would likely migrate with the weather in search of new resources and food to scavenge, jumping between these oases and a frozen desert. Exploring this concept could actually be kind of a cool idea for a Frostpunk spin-off, where you must migrate rather than be in a stationary city. Think something like Wandering Village or Last Train Home. We obviously see that people can survive in the Frostlands, even if just barely. I mean, there are enough people living out there that we have to develop an immigration policy for them in Frostpunk 2. Surviving against the conditions is just the first hurdle of living in this new frozen world. While animals like reindeer and muskoxen can survive extreme cold, they ultimately rely on spring thaws and tundra for plants to graze upon. Just because these grazers do dig under the snow to eat dried grass in our world, doesn't mean that would be sustainable for decades of winter. Without a thaw, there is no growing season, so food sources in the Frostland would be limited to lichens and hot springs where plant growth is possible. But in Frostpunk 2, we can find herds that seem to be absolutely thriving. We could, at least in some part, attribute this to the lack of predators in the whiteout years. While Arctic wolves can survive similar temperatures as reindeer, they also need to expend much more energy to hunt, and not every hunt will be successful. Energy, which is a precious resource in this world. In addition, humans wouldn't be able to venture out beyond their cities during the whiteout years. So it's possible that these herds migrated away from the storms to find food and shelter, allowing their numbers to grow unabated for years as they faced minimal pressure from predators. All the while, somehow, managing to find enough food to continue sustaining their growing herds. Normally, the loss of predators or overpopulation of grazers should trigger a trophic cascade, as they overconsume and deplete all plant life, thus leading to starvation. This is what happened on St. Matthew's Island when reindeer were introduced there in 1944. Originally intended as a food source for the US Coast Guard stationed on the island before it was abandoned. The reindeer population on the island exploded from the original 29 to over 6,000 in the early 1960s, due to abundant food and a total lack of predators. But by 1966, their population dropped dramatically to a sickly 42, with no breeding population, as they had depleted the island's grass and lichens, causing thousands of reindeer to starve after a harsh winter of 1963 to 64. And by the 1980s, the remainder had all died off. In Frostpunk's world, food supplies would be even more constrained due to a constant frost, but they would also have the advantage of being able to migrate rather than being trapped on a small island. To once again refer back to one of my previous videos, it could be explained that while this snapshot of the world as we know it is frozen, there must be areas that aren't frozen. We could say that the equator is cold, but still habitable. Most life died off as their ecosystems collapsed, and over time Arctic life came to fill the vacuum. Now, reindeer who can survive the cold find themselves with limitless land to graze. But the word if is the biggest two-letter word in the English language. While it's plausible that wildlife could survive most of the temperatures we find in the game, they will ultimately be limited by food supplies. Their survival hinges on a bunch of assumptions about the world, which I really don't like to do for these videos. But what I do find most interesting are the implications of this. If animals can find a way to survive and even thrive in this new frozen world, then it lends credence to adaptation ideology. If animals can find so much food and shelter by themselves out in the Frostland, then certainly with a bit of grit and human ingenuity, then the world could be repopulated well beyond the generator cities. After all, we do find human settlements surviving in the Frostland, even if just barely. And certainly, if Frostpunk 2 needed an overhaul DLC like they did with Heating and Fractured Utopias, it would definitely be a Frostland and Colonies overhaul. But that is a story for another day.